Okay, hello everyone, welcome. The Anglo-Israel Association is delighted to welcome you to this webinar. The title is After Qassem Soleimani, Israel and the Iran-Hezbollah Response. This will be with Dr. Raphael Marcus of the War Studies Department at King's College London. Dr. Marcus received his PhD from King's College London, and he's also affiliated with the college with King's College London's Insurgency Research Group, where his research interests include Middle Eastern security studies, terrorism, military affairs, and organizational learning. He is also the author of a book called Israel's Long War with Hezbollah, Military Innovation and Adaptation Under Fire, published by Georgetown University Press. The format today will be Dr. Marcus will speak for about 40 minutes, and then we will open for Q&A. Please submit your questions using the Q&A message box at the bottom of your screen. Dr. Marcus, thank you so much for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yaakov, and thank you to Ruth Saunders and the Anglo-Israel Association for hosting me. The last time I got to speak to everybody at the Anglo-Israel, we enjoyed a nice wine reception and book launch at Rusi, which feels like a year and a half ago, feels like an eternity. Instead, we're all sitting here in our offices and bedrooms on Zoom, but it's been quite the year, but I'm very delighted to be speaking to everybody. It's hard to believe that nearly a year ago, an eternity. Sorry? Offices and bedrooms on Zoom, but it's been quite the year, but I'm very delighted to be speaking to everybody. It's hard to believe that nearly a year ago, an eternity. You hear the echo?
Sorry, was it for me? Sorry, that's the Facebook.
Oh, it was my recording. Okay, no problem.
Yeah. Sorry.
No problem. So it's been almost a year since the United States killed General Qassem Soleimani, who was head of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Quds Force, which is sort of a extraterritorial clandestine branch of the Revolutionary Guard, responsible for operations overseas. Now, I sort of want to examine, given it's been a year, sort of if the calculus has changed regarding this Iranian response and the Iranian will to respond, and what this response might look like. Because I think there's been several important events that have sort of happened over the last year that have sort of changed the game a little bit. But I also wanted to examine, sort of with historical context, the nature of the Iranian response in general. Just yesterday, the head of the IRGC Aerospace Force, General Hajizadeh, says, taking revenge for Soleimani is something definite and certain. So even though it's been a year, they have not forgotten about this. This General Hajizadeh was actually the one who was responsible for shooting down the Ukrainian Airlines plane, several days after the assassination. But these guys have not forgotten about this. General Salami, who's head of the IRGC, was recently in Iraq just 2 days ago, and he says, this response to the assassination, we haven't forgotten about it, and that, we're going to respond on the battlefield against the United States. And the Ayatollah over the summer, we're going to deal a reciprocal blow to the United States. So very clearly, this is still in the consciousness of the Iranians, even though everybody is, is focused on all our other pressing issues. This is still very much front of mind. If anybody saw the New York Times this morning, there's a report that President Trump, in his last few days in office, has asked the Pentagon for various strike options to hit Iran if it decides to make a break for enrichment and nuclear weapons. Iran picked up on these reports and says, if the United States decides to strike us, we're going to respond harshly. And then sort of the icing on the cake, Israel's energy minister, Yuval Steinitz, who is quite well known and quite outspoken, says, if I were the Iranians, I would not feel at ease. I think if they decide to break towards enrichment, they'll face a response from the United States. And then he sort of glibly says, and possibly other countries. So not so subtle, but sort of a heightened tensions between the United States, Israel, and Iran, with the Iranians still talking about revenge. So I'd like to sort of discuss sort of how we got to this point, give you a brief timeline over the last year, sort of highlight some of the implications of the assassination or killing of Soleimani, and discuss Iran's sort of multimodal form of asymmetric warfare, the Iranian response in historical context. Because I think a lot of what we may expect, or what we sort of the various security establishments around the world have been planning for, is based in part on the historical experience dealing with Iran. I also would like to discuss briefly the history of the proxy relationship between Iran and its most prominent proxy, Hezbollah. So I think you can't really discuss a possible Iranian response without at least touching upon Hezbollah's capabilities and global operations. And I'll give you what I hope is a sort of a fair threat assessment based on an analysis of Iranian and Hezbollah global operations, and sort of highlight the pathway ahead, or what we may expect in light of increased U.S. sanctions on Iran, Trump's departure, incoming Biden, and sort of the broader landscape. All that within hopefully around 30 minutes. So how do we get to where we are? Just to remind everybody, I know again it's been hard to believe, been almost a year. In the run-up to last January, if you recall, the United States had pulled out of the JCPOA, the nuclear deal that President Obama had sort of got put into place. There was this increasing United States sanctions against Iran across the board, a lot of pressure built up by the United States Treasury Department. And also, if you remember, there was in December several mysterious sort of explosions in the Straits of Hormuz against various oil tankers and ships. And this, is right in Iran's backyard, a vital shipping lane. And there was all sorts of explosions against ships, anti-mining, which sort of contributed to this tension. And Iran downed an American drone just a month prior. This was sort of the context for an attack by Kataib Hezbollah, so the Hezbollah brigades, which is an Iraq-based Shi'ite militia, different than Lebanese Hezbollah, of course, targeted a U.S. military contractor who was killed at a military base in Kirkuk, Iraq. Then, of course, the United States responds with airstrikes against some of these Kataib Hezbollah, Iraqi Shia militia bases in Iraq and Syria. This leads to this quote-unquote protest by uniformed members of Kataib Hezbollah, who sort of stormed the U.S. embassy in Iraq. What I think was important to highlight about that event a year ago is that it was highly calibrated. Unlike Benghazi or other embassy incidents, nobody was killed, no hostages, and the inner wall of the embassy was not breached. I think that was all sort of highly intentional and highly calibrated. But the U.S. Department of Defense rules Iran responsible. And the Kataib Hezbollah militiamen who sort of stormed the walls didn't even conceal their identities. They were in uniforms with their patches. And of course, Iran sort of sponsors a plethora of Iraqi Shia militias, Kataib Hezbollah, or the Popular Mobilization Forces, PMF, being sort of the most prominent that we've heard about. In any event, this was sort of the run-up to the drone strike that killed Qassem Soleimani on January 3rd, along with Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes, who was the head of the Popular Mobilization Force, the PMF. Sort of a side note, he's a very interesting character, Mohandes, a long history in sort of Shiite militancy. He actually had a role in the 1983 bombings in Kuwait of the US and French embassies. This, of course, happened about 2 months after the big 1983 Marine Corps barracks bombing in Beirut, when Hezbollah drives a truck bomb into US Marine Corps barracks, kills 241 Marines. 2 months later, there's this Kuwait attack, and Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes is actually implicated in that. And this results, just to remind you about how all this is sort of connected, the Kuwaitis round up 17 Shiite militiamen who are responsible for this big attack. And in response, this leads to sort of a wave of kidnappings of dignitaries and journalists, etc., in Lebanon, if you remember the sort of kidnapping crisis of the 80s. And this is, of course, why Terry Waite from the Anglican Church is sent to Lebanon to help negotiate for the release of those kidnapped who were themselves kidnapped in response to the arrest of these Kuwaiti bombers, including Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes, who's Iraqi. So it sort of shows you there's there's a long history. These guys have a long history of activity and lots of, if you follow the historical thread, what goes around has sort of come around. So Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes is killed alongside Soleimani. In any event, The Iranian response is in the conventional military sphere. On January 8th, they fire those the rocket strikes against Ain al-Assad and Erbil, two U.S. military bases. Nobody's killed, but does probably give upwards of 100 soldiers traumatic brain injury from the shock blasts of the blast waves of the explosion. But President Trump, after that sort of those airstrikes, says, there's no further military response, or the United States military is deterring Iran from anything further. And Iran itself says, we're content with our conventional military response. The immediate implications of the death of Soleimani, the Iraqi parliament decides to vote the United States out of Iraq. So this is sort of the background, the political pressure within Iraq to get the United States out. The United States, has to focus on force protection instead of fighting ISIS. And Iran decides, in light of this, we're going to start working up our uranium enrichment again and pull out formally. And according to the IAEA, the Atomic Energy Agency, they have indeed increased their enrichment. They are now in violation of the accords that the U.S. had previously pulled out of. In any event, the replacement for Soleimani is a guy named General Ismail Vani, who was Soleimani's deputy in the IRGC Quds Force since 1997. So I wouldn't envision too much of a difference. They have a similar military background, similar military experience together. I'd say the only difference is perhaps less clout than Soleimani had. So regarding an Iranian response, to sort of set the historical backdrop here, I think it's important to recognize that Soleimani, in a sense, wrote the book on the Iranian asymmetric response. He himself was a veteran of the Iran-Iraq War. He's that generation of Iranian military generals who fought in the Iran-Iraq War, who fought between 1980 and 1988, a extremely bloody war, killed upwards of 500,000 to 800,000, 1 million Iranians and Iraqis. And this was really military versus military, with rockets and chemical weapons and real decimation of cities and armies. And I think the experience that Soleimani had, and indeed the entire sort of Iranian military generation that fought in this war, is that Iran doesn't want to fight conventional wars in the future. And I think this contributes to Iran sort of devising this asymmetric sort of warfare capability, where the head-to-head, army versus army, is really not the way they want to do things. When Soleimani dies, Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, gives several very interesting eulogies in the weeks after the attack. And sort of he even describes it as the school of military thought. The school of Qassem Soleimani is something that should be studied in military academies. And I think it's sort of the school of Qassem Soleimani, if you want to call it that, is essentially three-pronged. Number one, it's important to recognize that the Iranians are indeed, rational, reciprocal, and highly calculated in the way that they do things. Despite a lot of the rhetoric and the bluster and these military parades where they're stomping on U.S. and Israeli flags and all the bluster, they are highly rational and fair and quite calculated. But regarding this school of thought, there's been some talk of, you could call it hybrid if you like that term, but essentially a multimodal asymmetric response, which conventional military strength is only one piece of it. And the other three are the use of non-state proxies, so non-state militant and terrorist groups. Most prominently would be Hezbollah, who's in a sense their greatest success story regarding the fundraising of a proxy force. Of course, a huge component is the cyber realm and cyber hacking, and the fourth pillar after conventional non-state proxy cyber is terrorism. So in light of this, so this is sort of the four-pronged approach which Soleimani and the Quds Force perfect in a sense. Now, what's important to remember is that the Iranians say even just recently, it doesn't matter to us who wins the election, Trump or Biden. Our issue is with the entire United States government. The foreign minister Zarif, who's considered more moderate than most, said at a recent talk in New York, he says, the book is not closed in response to the Iranian, in response to this issue. So I wanted to highlight, in a sense, some of the important themes that have come up in Nasrallah's speeches as the most, in a way, the spokesperson for all of Iran's proxies, in a sense. Hezbollah being the most prominent, the most sophisticated, the best trained militarily, the most successful militarily. Sort of just to give you, to understand the Hezbollah-Iran relationship, sort of highlight very quickly a sort of history of that proxy relationship. You know, Iran sent IRGC to Lebanon in 1982. Hezbollah, as we know, and this is sort of beyond the confines of this talk, but I mentioned this if you were at the book launch, my book launch a year or two ago, discussed in depth sort of how Iran contributed to the rise and military development of Hezbollah in Lebanon in the 1980s. Of course, Iran and Hezbollah share that theological, they both view the Ayatollah or the supreme leader as the sort of absolute authority for religious, judicial, and political matters. They look to Iran as sort of the source of emulation, sort of just from the theological side of the house. And Iran, a cornerstone of their whole, post 1979 is exporting the Islamic Revolution. And this sort of explains why Iran gives help to Shiites around the world, in Yemen, in Bahrain, and of course in Lebanon and elsewhere. And the IRGC trains Hezbollah in the 1980s, and Hezbollah, I went into this a lot in the book, but they develop, and their military capability becomes very sophisticated towards the 1990s, towards the end of the 1990s, thanks to that assistance from the Iranians, and cover and concealment tactics, explosives, etc. And what's very interesting is that when Nasrallah sort of eulogizes Soleimani, he describes some of the key milestones of how Soleimani helped Hezbollah. And he says, despite, he really gives you could really see the personal, they also had a personal relationship. He was quite distraught by the death of Soleimani. I think he even cried in his eulogy, televised eulogy. But he describes how these IRGC generals and IRGC fighters came, even though Iran was fighting the Iran-Iraq war, where they're losing hundreds of thousands of soldiers. He says, they came to help Hezbollah in 1982, and they trained us, and they really helped us. And this is, of course, Hezbollah's fighting Israel, who rumbled into Lebanon in 1982. And Hezbollah learns a lot. And I think he really highlights Nasrallah in his speeches. 1998 is when Qassem Soleimani becomes head of the Quds force. So he was in that position for 22 years before or 21 years before he was, or 20 years, my math, sorry, before he was killed. But he says, when he becomes head of the Quds force, this was the time when Hezbollah makes the most qualitative improvements vis-a-vis Israel, thanks to Qassem Soleimani. Nasrallah likes to give that credit to Soleimani in his speeches. And sort of he describes how Iran helped Hezbollah with their weaponry, improving their rocket capability, and describes sort of the qualitative improvement in their attacks against Israel in the 2 years leading up to the withdrawal. Of course, Israel withdraws from Lebanon in 2000. So post 2000, he sort of describes that Soleimani, convinces us to sort of enter into a new phase fighting Israel. We're no longer, it's not just going to be guerrilla warfare on the ground in Lebanon, but we're going to take the battle to Israel, so to speak. We're not going to rely exclusively on guerrilla warfare. We're going to expand our sort of military capability. And he credits Soleimani with helping them develop this rocket and missile capability. And, almost to quote, he says, this wasn't easy for us as a guerrilla group. We needed expertise. We needed weapons to build the launching pads, to hide it within Lebanon, hide it from Israel, hide it from rival political groups in Lebanon. He describes how Soleimani helped Hezbollah with their drone capability, which we did see in 2006. Now we see explosive-laden drones, with ISIS and elsewhere. But Hezbollah were, in a way, one of the militant groups to sort of perfect this early on, as early as 2006, putting explosives on drones. And he says, Nasrallah says that Soleimani were the ones to sort of help them with that. He also describes the help that they got from their land and sea capability. Land and sea missile, or land to sea, service to sea. If you recall, in the 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah, a Israeli naval corvette, a ship called the Hanit, was actually struck by a Hezbollah missile, and he sort of credits Soleimani for getting us these missile capabilities, and he references all those events which I just eloquent and very well-spoken leader, and he puts a lot out there in the public domain when he gives his very long speeches. So, it's very interesting, and in a way provides a roadmap for us as to some of what Hezbollah is sort of posturing and their strategic intentions. Post-2006, he sort of describes how during the 2006 war, I should say, how despite of the Israeli bombs hitting Beirut, Qassem Soleimani decides to come from Syria to Lebanon to help us during this war. And he says, we tried to convince him to not come, to not fight. It was too dangerous because Israel's bombing the bridges and the roads, but he decides to come anyway. And Iman Mughniya, who was sort of Hezbollah's terrorism chief, if you like that term, and Qassem Soleimani helped us sort of devise our response during the 2006 war. In any event, this sort of is just a broad strokes for why Hezbollah and Iran, and that's just giving you a description of that long relationship together. So Nasrallah sort of describes, he says, if it would have been Soleimani, we would have if it would have been anybody except for Soleimani, we would be content to let the Iranians deal with this themselves. But because they targeted Soleimani, this demands a response from the axis of resistance, from the Shi'ite militias and the Shi'ite, Iran's Shi'ite allies. And I think what's the most important thing to highlight is that he says Iran isn't asking us to respond, but if Shiite groups do respond, it's not because Iran asked them, it's because they feel their own responsibility. And this deniability for Iran is sort of a consistent theme for Iranian and Hezbollah sort of global terrorist operations and military operations. And he says, what's a fair price? A fair price for Soleimani has to be, and he sort of opines, is it going to be the head of central command of the US military, the Secretary of Defense? And he sort of purposely leaves it vague. And then, he says, not even the shoes of Qassem Soleimani are equal to Trump, but, we should consider striking, is it a general? And he sort of leaves it out there in the open. Of course, now if you fast forward, there was just a leaked threat in the US media about an Iranian threat to the US ambassador to South Africa. This was just a month ago or so, and I think the leak was calibrated from Washington. But the US military and the US security establishment have sort of been tracking possible Iranian responses through this whole year. And they said, in light of Soleimani, there was this leak that there was a threat against the US ambassador to South Africa. And we always sort of thought that the response would be to someone that they could put on par with with prestige politically or militarily, sort of a targeted assassination of a high level figure. One thing that Nasrallah does emphasize is that he says that I want to be very clear, we're not going to target American citizens, American people, he says, we know that there are American citizens, journalists, businessmen all throughout the Middle East, but we're not going to take the fight to them. I guess it sort of begs two questions. Number one, do we believe them? And number two, do we think that Nasrallah is speaking on behalf of all the other Shiite militia groups and Shiite proxies elsewhere, perhaps some which have less sort of Iranian control over them? Are they going to toe the line? Sort of two questions. I think we probably do believe Nasrallah. I'm a little bit less confident as to some of these Iraqi groups where there's a little bit less direct Iranian command and control over them. In any event, Nasrallah also sort of mentions, he makes a clear reference to the effectiveness of suicide bombing. And he says, we remember how easy it was to get the Americans out of Lebanon. Of course, a very clear reference to the Marine Corps barracks bombing of 1983, which was a Hezbollah truck bomb. And this is when he says, we're gonna, the US military came into the Middle East standing up, and then they leave horizontally. And he makes this hand gesture, which then sort of went viral around the Shiite world, that they're gonna leave horizontally, meaning in coffins. And he also just to provide some historical context, he also says Hezbollah has their own experiences in devising sort of just and equal responses to the loss of its leadership. This is, I think, a very clear allusion to the 1992 assassination of Abbas Musawi, who was Nasrallah's predecessor for Hezbollah. And of course, the response to the Musawi killing in 1992 by the Israeli Air Force in Lebanon was the 1994 Argentina bombings of the Jewish Community Center, the AMIA bombings in Buenos Aires, which involved, in a sense, this toxic combination of Iranian diplomatic cover, Hezbollah operatives on the ground in Lebanon. Of course, there were Interpol red notices eventually put out against the Iranian diplomatic staff in Buenos Aires for sort of facilitating aspects of the attack. Hezbollah sent guys from South America to South America, excuse me. And I think this is sort of representative. You know, Nasrallah, I think, is quite calibrated in his use of language. In any event, the immediate response comes by striking those two U.S. military bases. And like I mentioned, Zarif, the foreign minister, says Iran has taken and concluded its proportionate measures in self-defense. And this sort of concludes our response. And what I think this really means is that this is the formal declared Iranian military response, which has been concluded. And now it's, in a sense, we wait for the proxy or terrorism response as sort of a time of their choosing. And I think it's important to emphasize the sort of long memory of the Iranians. If you think about the Mousawi assassination in '92, the response came in 1994. So it took 2 years. I mean, there was also a bombing in just several weeks after '92 at the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires. So it illustrates, number one, their capability when they have networks in place, and also their long memory. Which, you know, in '94, one of the reasons the claim of responsibility highlights the death of Mousawi. So I think we're gonna see, you know, the Soleimani's assassination is something that's not going to go anytime soon. You know, it's a little bit beyond the scope, but the cyber operations and cyber attacks by the Iranians is a key component of sort of the Iranian response. And they've hacked a plethora of different American, European, and Israeli websites. And I can happy to get into that in the Q&A if there's any questions. But, you know, I think that they have state-sponsored hackers. They have the IRGC sort of cyber hacking capability and sort of hacktivists, if you like. That's, I think, an important component as well. But I think the sort of the proxy asymmetric / terrorist component is the most sort of likely that we're going to see, because number one, it's deniable, and they can target either U.S., Israeli, and Jewish targets. I think the 2012 Burgas, Bulgaria attack is a very good example of the kinds of things that, you know, we should expect to see. This was, of course, the bombing of an Israeli tourist bus in Bulgaria, which killed, I think it was 4 tourists and their Bulgarian bus driver. And it took the Bulgarians, with help from very clearly the United States and Israel, a little bit of time to sort of figure out who was actually responsible. You had what looked like a suicide bomber using a fake identity, you know, another guy who was a dual citizen. And if you keep in mind, this was in the backdrop, there was several foiled Iranian and Hezbollah plots during this time. You know, this was when Israel was allegedly going after Iranian nuclear scientists, and the response came with foiled plots in Azerbaijan and Georgia, and there was that attack in India, Thailand, Malaysia, etc. So I think the use of proxies and the use of terrorism is one of the cards that Iran holds. Now, this may not have made as much of a splash in the UK, but in the US, there's been 3 fairly high-profile arrests of Hezbollah operatives over the last 3 years that have been sort of released to the public. There was 2 arrests in 2017. Of course, the 3, I just think it's important to highlight, obviously, these 3 arrests happened before Soleimani's death, but I think what it very clearly indicates is, number one, the means and the intent and sort of the pre-planning, that this is something that Iran and Hezbollah have in their back pocket for a time that they decide to use it. There was 2 arrests in 2017, one a Hezbollah operative in New York City and one in Michigan. Both Lebanese, both have been in the United States for quite some time. The first in New York was sort of was accused of taking surveillance photographs of various government establishments in New York City, as well as the Israeli consul in New York. He was sort of tasked by his handlers to scope out, you know, IDF veterans in New York, And he did surveillance of a U.S. military recruitment station in Manhattan, as well as JFK and LaGuardia airports, the two big airports in New York City. And I think what's interesting is he also, this is all in court documents, all out in the public, he traveled to China at the behest of Hezbollah to sort of procure explosives, to procure ammonium nitrate from China. Now this is important. I'll get back in 1 second. So again, he's looking at government targets. The second guy in Michigan, arrested at the same time, was accused of surveilling the Panama Canal, a maritime infrastructure. And according to court documents, he handled explosives at a Hezbollah safe house in Thailand and Malaysia. If you remember, there was sort of an explosion at an Iranian safe house in Thailand where they seem to have been planning some sort of attack. And this, I think, is sort of regarding the Iranian Hezbollah response. It's not necessarily going to be in our backyards. It'll be somewhere that's easier for them to operate, places like Thailand, Malaysia, parts of South America, because it's a little bit more deniable. They can sort of cover their tracks a little bit more easily there. But again, a guy with explosives training. The third guy was arrested in New Jersey just last year, 2019. And he was surveilling tourist sites as early as 2003, 2004, 5, 6, all the way through looking at the UN, the Statue of Liberty, Times Square, all these sort of iconic New York sites. So it's hard to believe we never really, it's so brazen for Hezbollah to be operating on U.S. soil to this extent. And I think within the last 3 years, the U.S. has made, a lot of efforts in sort of rolling up Hezbollah's global terrorism apparatus, at least in the United States. There's also been the arrest in California of 2 Iranian operatives who were actually accused of surveilling a Jewish center in Chicago. It was a Chabad house, actually, as well as Iranian dissident rallies in New York City. So just to sort of highlight, the means and capability have been there for years. The third Hezbollah operative rolled up had been in place since 2003, 2004. So this is sort of a long-standing Iranian strategy. And I don't know if anybody noticed, there was actually an article in the Daily Telegraph in June of this year, which highlighted a stockpile of ammonium nitrate belonging to Hezbollah, which was seized, or the stockpile was raided by the Metropolitan Police in London. So, the United States and Israel seem to indicate that Hezbollah had sort of this global terrorist apparatus, and ammonium nitrate featured prominently in all 3 U.S. Plots that were thwarted. These 3 operatives all had either experience with ammonium nitrate or had procured ammonium nitrate. Now there's a stockpile of Hezbollah ammonium nitrate that was seized in London, and this only came to light 4 years later in the Daily Telegraph scoop. Of course, the Burgas, Bulgaria attack, as well as that Hezbollah attack, if you recall, in Cyprus, thwarted attack, all utilized or attempted to be utilized ammonium nitrate. So just sort of highlighting that these procurement networks to get bomb-making materials is clearly something that was quite well developed. And I think this growing realization of the sophistication of the Hezbollah, Iranian, IRGC sort of global terrorism apparatus did contribute to the UK eventually designating Hezbollah in its entirety as a terrorist organization. For a long time, there was only a handful of countries, the United States, Canada, Israel, etc., who viewed Hezbollah in its entirety, political and militant wings, as a terrorist group. And I think post-Bulgaria, post-Burgas attack, post-Hezbollah involvement in Syria, and these other thwarted attacks all contributed to this. This led also the UK and Germany, and now we're even seeing other smaller countries like the Czech Republic and Guatemala, countries that are signing up to sort of designate the group in its entirety, which sort of contributes to the pressure against the group. Nasrallah in a speech also sort of highlights, because we know that in the Israelis, their soft spot is casualties, is their soldiers' lives. And he says, so this is sort of a lesson we learned fighting Israel over the long conflict. But for America, the soft spot is their economy and his money. And this did lead, and he did sort of suggest possibly targeting there seems to be a suggestion of possibly targeting U.S. economic infrastructure via proxy. What that actually means, could it be oil facilities? Could it be against Saudi facilities? Could it be the use of the Houthis? There are lots of things that we could sort of hypothesize, but he does suggest that it's not just a comprehensive confrontation he suggests it is a comprehensive confrontation, not just to hit militarily, but also perhaps, the political pressure to get the U.S. out of Iraq, and this sort of economic pressure. Now, just last month, the U.S., like I mentioned, seems to have thwarted this Iranian threat against the U.S. ambassador to South Africa. In light of Soleimani's stature, like I said, we kind of figured that the response would come against somebody of equal stature, a U.S. military official, an ambassador, and that this sort of illustrates that this threat picture is still very much active. So, just this sort of brings us to where we are. There's been a change in an equation within the last month. And just 6 days ago, on November 11th, which is Martyrs' Day for Hezbollah, sort of when they mourn their slain martyrs, so to speak, Nasrallah says very clearly that he's very happy that Trump lost the election, that Trump's been humiliated at the polls. Because Trump killed Soleimani, we're very happy that he's humiliated. And he says that Trump is taking America down with him, and this is all great for Iran and Hezbollah because 1/3 of this triangle, of Israel, the Saudi Arabia, and the United States, 1/3 of the triangle is now down, thanks to Trump. Now, I think the big question is, in light of Trump's loss and Biden, the new administration coming in January, where does this leave things regarding this Iranian response? Because I've highlighted, the long-standing relationship between Iran and Hezbollah, Iranian and Hezbollah sort of strategic planning, that if, for having that external operations capability, it's been something that very much, they've been preparing for. And they've said very clearly that getting the United States out of Iraq is their primary goal, and that the target will be against the United States military or government trying to shy away from the civilian aspect. Even though Hezbollah operatives, like the ones we saw in the United States, were doing surveillance of civilian sites like the airports and Statue of Liberty and Times Square, etc. In any event, with Biden coming in, I think we're actually going to see Iran and Hezbollah play it cool temporarily, so to speak. They don't want to force the incoming Biden administration to take a hard line. He said very clearly he's going to try and re-engage with Iran, re-engage the JCPOA deal, try and get some sort of nuclear agreement back on the cards. And any, brazen or brash Iranian or Hezbollah move at this point would force the U.S. administration to sort of take a hard line with them. And I think this is obviously something they don't want. They think they can get a better deal or at least improve their quite bleak situation in light of the new administration coming in. I think it's also important to emphasize COVID certainly plays a role. Both Iran and Lebanon have been decimated in a sense by COVID with very, very high fatality rates and a sort of dysfunctional government response. We want to talk about Hezbollah and the possibility of war with Israel, or Hezbollah possibly retaliating against Israel, Jewish targets of the United States overseas. I think in truth, the risk and the threat has actually temporarily declined. The Lebanese economy is in shambles. They're hyperinflation. They can't get money out of ATM, of cash points. There's a lot of domestic discontent against Hezbollah, against the government. I think that massive explosion in the port of Beirut, which very questionably maybe implicated Hezbollah, maybe not, or at least on the rumor mill. That's what everyone in Lebanon seems to suggest. None of that has helped Hezbollah's standing. So I think, these issues have all contributed to sort of lowering the temperature, so to speak. This doesn't change the fundamental calculus and the stated goals and intentions. Rather, it doesn't the stated goal, but it does change perhaps the immediate intention. Perhaps the assassination of this Al-Qaeda figure allegedly by Israeli operatives. I only know as much as you do from reading the newspaper. at the behest of the United States in Iran may sort of change Iran's calculus slightly, where they feel so humiliated to have had Israeli operatives assassinate an enemy of America on Iranian soil. But I think there's not going to be an immediate response from Iran or Hezbollah, at least until after January. I think this year was a tense one, but in light of these the domestic mess in Iran and Lebanon, we have actually a temporary cooling. I think at least until after January. However, Iran and Hezbollah have voiced their desire to respond and to retaliate loud and clear, and we know from their past actions militarily and their past sort of global terrorist operations, the capability is clear, and the means to carry out something like that is clear. The big question is sort of the immediacy and the overarching intent to retaliate. And I think in light of the deniability and opacity sort of being the fundamental pillars of Iran and Hezbollah's sort of global sort of terrorist response, I think we're thinking more a posture of long-term vigilance. And I think the Biden administration certainly is going to have their hands full. So what I hope I just did in 35 minutes was sort of I described how we got to where we are today, how we got to this point regarding tensions between Iran, the United States, and its Shiite proxies, discussed the sort of origins and development of the Iranian-Hezbollah proxy relationship, which is why I think Nasrallah, whose speeches and statements I gave a lot of attention to, I think we have to take them seriously in light of his very clear pipeline to the Iranian establishment, which is why we have to listen closely when Nasrallah does speak, because he is, one of the most articulate and open, in a sense, with sort of stating intentions. I also discussed the multimodal response from Iran and Hezbollah, the sort of capabilities and past operations that we've seen, which I think should inform our assessment of the future. Highlighted that historical background, some representative incidents in the past, including these recent arrests by Hezbollah, rather recent arrests of Hezbollah guys in the United States, and recent Hezbollah attacks of the last 10 years vis-a-vis Israel, United States, and Jewish targets, and highlighted in a sense the future scenario, at least I think anything more than making an immediate or near-term assessment is setting oneself up for failure. So I think with that, I'd be very happy for any questions that anybody has, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Raphael Marcus, for this fascinating talk and insights. Our first question is about two significant developments that we have seen recently on the Israel-Lebanon front. The first one is the maritime negotiations between the two countries that have been going on over the last couple of months. And the second is the growing voices within Lebanon calling for peace with Israel. For example, the daughter of the president of Lebanon that came out publicly on television saying that she thinks Lebanon should make peace with Israel, Israel is not an enemy, etc. What do you think, to what extent are these developments significant in the long run? And also, what do you think they mean for Hezbollah and Iran in terms of their control of Lebanon and their proxy war with Israel?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. In Nasrallah's recent speech on November 11th, on Martyrs' Day, he says, I don't want anyone to get the wrong idea here. We know that Lebanon and Israel are talking over these maritime disputes. He says, we view these as merely sort of technocratic. Don't let anyone get the wrong idea that this means that we're going to recognize Israel. They're still the enemy. They have, I believe, Nabi Berri, who's the Speaker of the Parliament and an ally of Hezbollah, Shi'ite. He's been involved in trying to get a good deal on these maritime boundaries for Lebanon. So he says, under no situation are we gonna normalize. There has been sort of rumblings within little pockets of Lebanon, and I saw those comments by Hariri's sister. I think we're a long way off with Lebanon. I think you're going to see probably in the coming months and year further deals between Sunni powers and Israel. But the Hezbollah is, they're the spoiler, and I think it has hurt their domestic standing to be viewed as such by other factions within Lebanon. So I think that they in a sense are cornered because they are viewed as this spoiler, and of course the economic overtones where they seem to be doing okay, financially, while everybody else can't get money out of the cash point, has sort of led to further, domestic discontent with Hezbollah in Lebanon.
Mm. Thanks. Another question: can you tell us more about the Biden administration and the Iran deal, and the Iranian response to that?
So I think Biden has indicated that he's going to attempt to, like I mentioned, renegotiate or put forward some sort of deal with the Iranians to try and get back on track to the deal that, as vice president, he was part of when Obama and John Kerry sort of got this deal forward. And I think this contributes to Iran probably behaving relatively, so to speak, for the next several months. They don't want to force Biden to have to come out harshly or severely against Iran. I think the more interesting sort of question is the Secretary of State Pompeo now is visiting the Middle East with Trump with less than 60, 70 days less even in office, floating the idea of a possible military response against Iran for violating the nuclear deal. I think the big question, which I don't have an answer to, though I don't think it's likely because he did walk it back, is he would be setting up Biden in a sense for failure for any future reconciliation with Iran. If Trump decides to hit Iranian targets in Iraq, which perhaps is more likely than a U.S. response against Iran, which I don't think is likely, but he did ask for the battle plans for it, which made everybody sort of raise an eyebrow, I think, in Washington. He's also been sort of cleaning out his defense staff. The Secretary of Defense was recently let go, with a new guy put in for the last 2-3 months. So this volatility within the defense establishment surrounding Trump did, I think, make everybody a little bit nervous. I think Biden has the opposite approach, where he's going to want to sort of amp things down, where it seems that Trump is sort of amping things up before he leaves.
Mm-hmm. Are there any signs of significant internal opposition within Iran?
So I think, just in the weeks leading up to Soleimani's killing in late 2019, early 2020, there was a lot of Iranian domestic protests, and it actually looked like perhaps there's been as early as the Green Movement 10 years ago, 2009, 2010. There is certainly a strata of Iranian society that is discontent with the brutality and the autocracy of the government. And we were seeing these sort of public, quite large demonstrations for the first time in a long time. And an unintended consequence of the Soleimani strike was that it sort of enraged the population because of the violations of sovereignty and the killing of Soleimani as this sort of, revered, famous leader. It sort of it dampened the sort of the public protests against the regime. I still think, in light of the Iran's COVID response and just the tens of thousands of deaths that they've had, and their terrible economic situation, partially because of U.S. Sanctions, against various, not just military sectors in Iran, but also industrial, petroleum, anything that we could remotely sort of associate to the Iranian defense establishment being sanctioned, has contributed to domestic discontent. Bread is more expensive, the rial is in very bad shape, but Iran is very good at keeping their population under their thumb. So I don't think we should expect any major changes regarding regime change, even though I think there is certainly a sector of the population that would like to see it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Another question with regards to the Chinese involvement in the axis of Iran and Hezbollah. Where do you see what part do the Chinese play, and do they provide, for example, Hezbollah with explosives or with materials that help them produce weapons?
So I think when I mentioned this Hezbollah operative who was arrested recently in New York, having traveled to China to procure explosives, that was not sort of like an official deal between China and Hezbollah. This was this operative going there undercover, so to speak, as a as a businessman to procure the ammonium nitrate, which can also be used in fertilizer and etc. So they weren't going there to sort of buy explosives right off. And there was also, they were buying ice packs, these disposable ice packs that you hit, which contain ammonium nitrate. So this was an official Chinese assistance to Hezbollah. Hezbollah does have some Chinese-made weaponry, though it's usually, they receive it not from China, but usually via Syria or generally by Syria from Iran. I think overall China's role with Hezbollah is pretty minimal. And the first part of the question was China's role with
the Chinese general involvement. What role does China play between Iran and Hezbollah in that axis?
Yeah, I think it's relatively minimal, but there is Chinese weaponry floating around. I mean, Chinese-Iranian relations a little bit beyond the scope is a different story, like a state-to-state level.
Okay. One more question. How do you see the Saudi response to Iran while Biden is now taking over the Oval Office? How do you see the Saudi-Iran politics is going to play out now with a new dynamic in Washington?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Saudis in a way have been the most consistent regarding their visceral and adamant, opposition to Iranian nuclear or making a rush, military development and nukes. Just, I think this, in light of, this back and forth between Trump and Iran and all the public statements, the Saudis say if Iran decides to make a dash for enrichment, we're going to try and develop a bomb ourselves. And everyone always suspected that if Iran was going to break out, you'd probably see Sunni powers, perhaps, certainly Saudi, maybe even Egypt, these countries that have signaled that they wouldn't tolerate a Shiite Iranian bomb in the Middle East. I mean, the Saudis, I think, are my impression, quite influential in the U.S. nowadays regarding some of the policies that we're seeing vis-a-vis Iran. This, of course, has contributed to the at least secret friendly relationship between the Saudis and Israel and all the Gulf countries. I think this mutual fear and animosity of Iran has, in a sense, been one of the major contributing factors to the Bahrain peace deal and the Emirati peace deal and all the other quiet relationships that are going on there now.
Right. These are all the questions we have. So we're just 3 minutes off the mark. Thank you, Dr. Raphael Marcus, for a fascinating talk and conversation. Thanks everyone for joining us, and have a great evening.
Thanks for having me.